Hello. Today I want to talk about categories that we use to classify people by race in the United States. These categories have sordid histories that are important to unpack in order to consider how our choices of when and where to use them in our contemporary context might have significant harmful consequences. These are the questions about race asked on the 2020 US Census. You'll notice that there are two questions, one on race and one on Hispanic origin. There are pre-specified categorical responses. These form the contemporary basis of federal statistics and the data that we have about race in the United States. These categories did not appear out of nowhere. They were constructed and reconstructed over the last 235 years. My goal today is to provide visibility into this history, drawing on the amazing work of others cited here who have traced these histories. I want you to get a glance at the politics of these categories to more strategically grapple with what it means for algorithmic systems to use them in the building of models. Let's begin our story with the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2 outlines the need for a decennial census for apportioning political power. In that clause, we can find our first explicit race category, Indians. Although truth be told, Indians were not actually seen as a race category then. Slavery and blackness were implicit in the clause, 3/5 of all other persons, but they were not explicitly articulated. They were simply the opposite of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. Even the 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868, which articulated birthright citizenship and undid the 3/5 clause, never mentioned race beyond upholding the exclusion of Indians not taxed. But back when the first census was conducted in 1790, the notion of whiteness does appear. Households were expected to articulate the number of white men by age clustering, the number of white women, the number of other free persons, and the number of slaves. Assistant marshals were not to count Indians not taxed, so they didn't need to articulate that as a category. In 1820, the census starts enumerating free colored males and females, as well as foreigners not naturalized. In 1850, we get a column on color with instructions for marking white, black, and mulatto. In 1870, that expands to include Chinese and American Indians. In 1890, quadroon, octoroon, and Japanese are added, although the former two are dropped in the following decade. Changes get made each and every decade. Mexican, Korean, Filipino, and Hindu appear in 1930, and the notion of a Hispanic or Spanish origin appears in 1980. Each decade has small twists and turns to these categories, with the opportunity for detailed race information appearing first in the form where parents were born and then as a subfield of a race field. In the US context, census data about race was used for decades to enable the exclusion of people, long after Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment. Indeed, this is why those who were initially labeled as Mexican wanted to be marked as white with respect to government race categories. But activists in the early part of the 20th century also realized that statistical data about race could help communicate inequality. In 1918, the Census Bureau published a report called The Negro Population 1790 to 1915. Produced by Negro clerks, this report profoundly identified an undercount of Black people in both the 1870 and 1890 censuses. This would create a kernel that defined the 20th century battles over whether the census was fair, although few would pay attention to the undercount issues until the 1950s. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, census categories get turned onto their head as they become a tool with which to fight discrimination in the courts. This prompted groups to want to be included in the census, to be visible and counted in order to fight for their rights. Herein we see people wanting to be seen by the state and advocates looking to ensure that their communities are counted and labeled appropriately. This fundamentally changes the tenor of federal statistics. It also means that advocates didn't want categories like Chinese and Japanese that were originally created to exclude. They didn't want them removed or clustered under a notion of Asian. Advocates wanted specificity. So as advocates pushed for more and more specificity, the federal government debated how to standardize categories. This created the build-up to the Office of Management and Budget's 1977 articulation of a formal list of race and ethnicity categories for use in federal statistics and administrative reporting. This directive, known as Statistical Directive 15, allowed the OMB to articulate the need to collect 5 race category data, although they permitted the option of the Hispanic origin category being separated from race because so many Hispanic and Latino advocates did not want to be identified as a race population. but they still had the 5 categories of American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, Hispanic, and white. Choose one, only one. They had more detail in their protocol, but this would become the foundational basis for civil rights compliance reporting, administrative and grant reporting, and statistical reporting. The 1980 census complied in its reporting, but still allowed people to self-select Japanese, Chinese, or other Asian subcategories. They were then processed as Asian or Pacific Islander category on the back end. And then they also chose to opt out of keeping Hispanic origin as a separate race category and put it as its own origin question. Of course, let's be clear, even as a range of groups advocated for the Hispanic populations to be understood as white, many people who descended from Mexico, Central America, and South America looked at census takers like they were from a different planet when asked about their race. Some identified with Chicano or Latino identities, but plenty marked other when asked about race separately, and many more preferred to mark labels that associated them with the geographies or countries from which they were descended. So the data were messy. They're still messy. In 1997, the OMB revisited their Directive 15 under pressure to alter the race categories. Melissa Nobles details this discussion in her phenomenal book, Shades of Citizenship. After intense public debates, OMB made 4 decisions. First, they changed Black to say Black or African American. Second, they dropped Pacific Islander from Asian and added a new category, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. Third, they created the ability for people to identify with multiple race categories. And fourth, they chose not to add a 6th race category that was highly desired at the time, Middle East North African, otherwise known as MENA. This final decision was especially challenging, revealing the political fracture of how these categories are constructed. Advocates did not agree on what they wanted. Some wanted a geographic category, Middle East, North African. Some wanted an ethnic category of Arab. Problematically, no one could agree on where the boundaries were. And then there's Israel. Were Israelis to be identified as MENA? It all depended on who was being asked. In the end, the OMB decided to avoid the decision. Now, thanks to the changes in Directive 15, the 2000 census, run by Ken Pruitt, was the first to allow people to mark multiple race options. But this introduced a different kind of a problem. Tribal nations are sovereign with very complex treaties negotiating the relationship between tribes and the United States federal government. These treaties, including federal funding formulas and aid, depend on census data. Tribal governments were worried that if Native peoples checked multiple boxes, that their population might be diluted and that federal government might use this to weaken the treaties. So many Native leaders pushed Indigenous communities to mark themselves as one and only one race. In the run-up to the 2020 census, a different issue emerged. Many Latino and Hispanic leaders wanted to get rid of the separate Hispanic origin box. It wasn't making sense. The Census Bureau had done its research and felt as though a single race category made much more sense for everyone involved. But the Trump administration blocked the merging of race and Hispanic origin in the 2020 census. So once again, those were separate questions. Now, if the Trump administration's investment in this category appears confusing, it might be helpful to know a little bit about where data are used. In the US, census data have 4 clear purposes. The first is apportionment, which is the population count as the basis upon which states are apportioned the representatives in the House. The second then is that the states then use redistricting data from the census in order to redistrict for all of their federal, state, and local elections. And with redistricting comes the Voting Rights Act, which is to ensure that the population is upheld with clear concern for ensuring fair and accurate representation. Third is the federal funding formulas that rely on census data. And fourth are all sorts of other surveys, sampling frames, polling, et cetera, that use nationally representative data based on the census each year. Now, buried in number 2, the Redistricting Commitment and the determination to uphold the Voting Rights Act is a dirty secret that shapes both Republican and Democrats' redistricting. Both parties have stereotypes about those who mark the Hispanic origin checkbox. It's not accidental that when the people are asked about Hispanic origin, they are to mark if they are Mexican, Puerto Rican, or Cuban. When redistrictors do their modeling, they assume that those who are Puerto Rican tend to turn out for Democrats. Those who identify as Cuban tend to vote Republican, and those who identify as Mexican are ineligible to vote, whether or not this is actually true. The Census Bureau doesn't publish detailed race until after redistricting takes place, but redistrictors use past detailed race data in order to model the probabilities of current Hispanic identified populations to understand who's likely to vote for their candidate. And they use detailed race in court cases to defend the Voting Rights Act. This detailed race category is both a tool of oppression and a tool of empowerment, rooted in a deeply racist and highly partisan logic. Now, race data in the United States has a range of racist origins, but today's advocates and politicians are also wedded to these data because they believe that this is how they can help ensure rights and also play partisan politics. Because census data and the OMB Directive 15 are managed through political systems, these categories reflect the political logics of the day. They are socially constructed, but not simply based on how people self-identify or how people are labeled in society. They are socially constructed through a political system. So OMB Directive 15 was revised by the Obama administration, but never formalized. And you can expect to see a variation of this coming forward over the next couple of months, where you can expect to see the MENA category added. Now, census data date back thousands of years. For most of this history, the purpose was to oppress. Censuses were used for taxation, for conscription, for genocide. Most people around the world still fear their country's census. People who were actually born in mangers because it was the law to return to their hometowns in order to be counted in the census. The US changed the game in 1790 when they chose to apportion power through a census. But this didn't mean that the data collected were not used also to abuse. The US changed the game again in 1964 when census data became central to anti-discrimination. But this did not eliminate discrimination. And we now live in a country where some people want to be seen by the state. They want to be recognized and counted to fight for their rights. Others are reasonably afraid of the census and how the data might be abused. Meanwhile, as census data and their categories continue to be contested, algorithmic systems are taking those categories wholesale. Our community here at FACT does so rooted in the promises of 1964 to use the data to challenge discriminatory actions. But in the process, we also reify categories as they've been politically constituted. This introduces many critical governance questions. Should our categorical choices involve critical commentary from the public, as the census categories do? Or are we going to uncritically defer to the political categories as they are constructed by our governments? If we do that, what does it mean that we will reinforce and cement those categories, making them even harder to be politically contested? And frankly, where is our moral responsibility in grappling with these categories? That is why I'm excited about this workshop today, and I encourage you to check out the work by all of these scholars who have been doing phenomenal work tracing through the histories of race categories in the census. Thank you.